Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to delve into the topic of Chaos War. In its most literal sense, we're not talking about hordes of screaming zealots here, mounds of fanatics or mighty chaos space marines bestriding mortal battlefields. Oh, no. We are talking about the conflict behind it all, the war between the gods. Since Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, all four are locked in a never-ending titanic struggle for power and dominance within the warp itself, the other side of the Eye of Terror, where the ruinous powers, play, frankly, at warfare. They even admit so themselves, referring to the conflict simply as the Great Game. It is a war that none have ever been even close to winning, and in all due likelihood, no one ever will. Since for one side to be truly victorious would require the eradication of another, the death of a chaos god. An act of such consequence that no one truly can even begin to fathom what might happen to the immaterium or the material world should such a thing come to pass. Now, one could theorize that the warp would simply return to its once placid state when the Eldar managed to exert dominance and control over it, and the old ones before that again, but forever and ever, the warp has always been a reflection of the material universe, and unless we return to the days of rulership by a single steward species, the warp will always have more than enough conflict to feed it, and so always more than enough power to continue spawning forth titanic armies to do battle on tremendous battlefields covered in blood, lava, endless ice, writhing thorn bushes, and plains of pulsating flesh. Because, of course, war in the void is quite different than in reality, even though the gods bind themselves by certain rules, certain gentlemen's agreements. For theoretically, technically, the realms of chaos can be as large or as small as any one of the gods want at any given time. If Tzeentch was ever in ascendancy, for example, nothing is theoretically stopping him, besides the power of the other gods, to simply invade their homelands, striking straight into their capital cities overnight via mass teleportation spells. Similarly, nothing is stopping Nurgle from concocting a plague so virulent, so horrific, that even the demonic hordes of his enemies would simply wither and die in front of it. Nothing is stopping Slaanesh from marching forth from his pleasure palace at the bottom of his 6 circles of seduction and causing every living creature, living in the metaphorical sense here, to submit to his sheer radiant beauty. Nothing is stopping Khorne from simply destroying the realms of chaos with a single slash of his axe. But that wouldn't be very fun, now would it? It would also be mutually assured destruction, since within the realms of chaos, dependent upon the waxing and the waning of power levels, the gods are de facto omnipotent and all-powerful. If one ever truly, genuinely sought the destruction of another, the other 3 would unite against him almost immediately. And this has happened on multiple occasions previously, where one power has been close to some sort of tipping point, and the other 3 have united against that power, to push it down before immediately after being split apart by their own internal bickerings, allowing the reeling party to rally once more. This should not be taken, however, as any kind of suggestion that the gods aren't trying. Oh, they absolutely are. Even if, again, at some sort of deep-found level, they understand that killing one another is either impossible or simply not a very good idea, Chaos gods are greedy by nature, as are all warp entities. We've talked about this before, but the one single soul unifying trait of every single demon, regardless of creed, regardless of alignment, regardless of type, etc., is that it always seeks to feed, to grow larger, more powerful, stronger, to secure more sustenance for itself. And there is no reason to believe that the gods are any different in that regard. And so Khorne sends forth endless legions of bloodthirsters across the blazing ramparts and into the realms of sorcery, even as the demons of Tzeentch infiltrate down the Great Tree into the land of the Plague Lord and begin raiding the Eternal Swamps. Even as Nurgle's plague bearers are marching across the rotting reaches to climb the tall mountain peaks surrounding Sinesh's homeland, as, you guessed it, keepers of secrets are leading hordes of demonettes up the boiling span. And we do actually have a map of the realms of chaos, though in all due reality a map is completely and utterly pointless, as the realms will change based upon the whims and wishes of their sovereign deity. The Brass Citadel might sit in the center of Khorne's land one day, or it might be somewhere completely else entirely. The Impossible Fortress might be floating far up in the relative north. North might be south. East might be west. Up might be down, etc., etc. One day the battlefield may be millions of miles away, fought by titanic armies led by kilometers-tall gargants. Another, they might be a couple hundred meters away, within easy view of the Brass Citadel, fought in fits and starts and minor skirmishes across the land. And there is some logistics involved in all of this as well. Again, the gods call it the Great Game for a reason, because they are bound by certain rules. In fact, the very idea of a realm of chaos in and of itself is a reflection of the human mind. It is our need to impose some sort of order on what is literally impossible to order. And so Khorne has his forgers. Tzeentch has his eyries and troop gatherings. The lands of the Plague Lords have their enormous spawning pits of pestilence and foul things that create plague bearers, and so on and so on. These armies require arming, they require weaponry and ammunition that must be built and created. Demonic weapons must be harnessed. Demonic creatures must be bound within swords. Armor of particular potency must be crafted in tall, towering structures, etc., etc., etc. And undoubtedly the rules of all of this, too, will change at a simple whim. The impossible may become possible, and the possible might become impossible. For example, many of you have probably heard the tale of Isha, the Eldar goddess of healing. She, like all the Eldar gods, were defeated by Slanesh when he was brought into being by their ferocious fornication rituals. But for reasons of plot relevancy, Isha was not devoured like the others, nor was she saved like Kaela Mensha Cain. Oh, saved is a interesting word to use in the context. Instead, she was captured and kept as a Slaneshi plaything. Perhaps he simply found her attractive, entirely possible. Perhaps he wished to steal her beauty or torture her because he couldn't bear to have anyone else rival his magnificence. The gods alone know why, but Nurgle took a particular interest in this and launched a tremendous invasion of the Dark prince's realms. Enormous waves of plague bearers simply washed over the newly born god's lands again and again and again. Maybe the war took minutes, maybe the war took decades or centuries or millennia. But in the end, Nurgle was victorious. He managed to wrest Isha from Slaanesha's grasp and bring her all the way back home to his mansion in the middle of his festering, plague-ridden lands. And this raises a great deal of interesting questions, doesn't it? Surely the Eldar goddess of healing, fertility, and yada would have been a very prized possession of Slaanesh, so obviously she would have been kept very deep within his realm, unless this was some kind of 4D chess move by the Prince of Pleasure, which seems unlikely, frankly. So he must have allowed her to be taken, or can a god actually inflict their will upon another if they bring to bear sufficient force? Was the fact that Slaanesh was a very new god the reason? Could Nurgle simply overwhelm Slaanesh's defenses? If so, to what point? Could Nurgle, the third most of the gods, potentially kill Slaanesh? If so, why hasn't he tried? Or more importantly, why hasn't Khorne tried? As no surprise, he's no fan of the sissy little tentacle lover. Or maybe this was an exceptional scenario because they weren't fighting to kill one another. Nurgle wasn't trying to wipe Slaanesh out, nor was he necessarily trying to seize territory or destroy Slaanesh's legions or anything like that. He had a specific objective in mind, and that objective was a non-warp entity. Well, it's not entirely correct. Isha is a warp entity like all the gods are, but she was not a chaotic entity, is probably a much better term. So perhaps she simply existed by different rules, maybe. Maybe she could be affected in a different way. What if you had a second Isha? Could Khorne claim her from Tzeentch? Could Tzeentch claim her from Khorne, etc.? Or was this a one-off mad exception that saw Nurgle's obsession overwhelm Slaanesh's ability to resist? Again, even then we are anthropomorphizing all of this as well by painting pictures of demonic hordes summoned forth by the demon lords. It would be just as accurate to see this as two amorphous blobs pushing in against one another, trying to bite off little pieces of amorphous blobbery to grow fatter themselves. Yet now Isha rests is probably not the correct word, hangs uncomfortably in the mansion of the Plague Lord in a rusted iron cage, as Nurgle feeds her all sorts of interesting things. Isha is immune to all plagues and toxins since she is the literal goddess of healing, but Nurgle doesn't really care. He just wants to see her reactions, shall we say, to the various plagues. We won't get too deep into the Nurgle philosophy here, but basically he wants to see what's particularly lethal and what isn't. If it's a good plague, he'll release it onto the lands of humanity. If it isn't, he'll just dump it to the side and start all over again. Either way, Isha's gonna have a rough few days. Though there is also a story in, I want to say, the Chaos Demons Codex, but don't quote me on that one, where a cabal of Eldar Psykers actually invaded Nurgle's lands specifically to try and free Isha. Now, they didn't succeed, nor did they ever even enter the Plague Lord's mansion, as they were overwhelmed by seemingly infinite numbers of plague bearers and monstrosities rising out of the swamps surrounding it. We don't even know if success was a theoretical possibility, if it was even something that could happen. After all, what would even occur if you managed to free Isha, the Eldar goddess of healing? Where would she go? Would she create her own pocket dimension? Could she be stored within a craft world like Kaela Mensha Canis? Could shrines be built? Could she be channeled in the form of an avatar? Many interesting questions. Again, however, they failed and were simply overwhelmed. Now, that too is another point to talk about, because whilst of course the demons themselves are waging constant war on tremendous battlefields requiring maneuvering of generals, requiring ploys, requiring magics, the invasions of fortresses that could be built in millennia or hours depending upon the whims of the gods. In fact, the northern frontier of Khorne's domain is literally a wall of kilometers tall, constantly erupting volcanoes. That gives you some idea as the kind of point defenses we might be talking about here. Yeah, relatively ridiculous stuff, but mortals can enter into the realm of the gods. It has happened on multiple occasions. We've even had full stories about this. And bearing in mind too, just in case anyone is confused, the realm of chaos is not a demon world. We know demon worlds can be invaded, we know they can be visited, we know they can be blown the hell up even, and we know that they can even be attacked with a degree of success, as we saw with a certain mad orc that invaded the Eye of Terror. And eventually, by the way, Tusker Demon Killer right now is fighting in front of the Brass Citadel, since after a few thousand years kicking ass on one of the Demon Prince's planets, Khorne decided that this is really goddamn cool and wanted him for his own. I can hardly blame him. An army of nut-kicking orc demon things that respawn every morning. Source of entertainment, absolutely. But anywho, I'm wandering off on a tangent here. So theoretically, very theoretically, humans could invade the realms of chaos. Now, whether or not they could do it on any kind of scale, that's a different question. Whether or not it would matter, no matter the scale, is another question yet again, because, well, the demon gods have, by all intents and purposes, literally infinite hordes of demons. But if this is a theoretical possibility for humanity, which several humans have entered the realms of chaos, either via invitation, sheer accident, or experimenting with things they really shouldn't be goddamn touching, or by being plucked out from the material world by the gods. But if this is possible, and the Eldar have shown that they can invade it as well, then surely a more psychically active or psychically understanding species could do it as well. Imagine, for example, a Necron invasion of the realms of chaos, since the Necrons really don't like chaos. What would a Necron monolith do if planted inside of the warp? That would be a very interesting happening, since Necron monoliths literally block warp energies. What about the Eldars themselves? Is there even the theoretical possibility that they could save Isha? Could they invade the realm of Nurgle? And if they did so, could Nurgle return the favor? Would Isha be a point of warp reality in the material world, since demons, of course, need the ability to manifest in our worlds using warp power? And it also, of course, again raises the question of exactly how much point there is in the demon war. Because the gods engage with it to very differing degrees. Khorne, for example, could again probably wipe out the entirety of the realm of chaos with a simple swing of his axe. He's pretty much done it before, when he has literally scarred the realm permanently. A permanent scar on the warp, whose only real constant is non-permanence. Let that sink in for a second there, but he prefers to be the general leading from atop his brass citadel and his skull throne, whereas Tzeentch doesn't really seem to honestly care over much. Oh, he'll defend himself, he'll launch some invasions here and there, he'll scheme and plot, absolutely, and he'll certainly encourage his demonic generals to partake in the war as a way to gain his favor. But he seems more interested in the material universe than the realms of chaos. Perhaps because, in a way, he's already won in chaos. He can do whatever he wants. The only constant is change, and, well, that is literally the definition of Tzeentch. Whereas the material universe must seem frustratingly static to him. So, obviously, he'd direct his attentions in a different direction. Slaanesh, meanwhile, well, he's, she's, they, them, whatever the hell, is kind of forced to pay a great deal of attention to the demonic war because, again, Khorne doesn't like him very much. And so he's no doubt going to be sending constant invasions poor little Slaanesh's way. And so he has to deal with all of that garbage whilst also trying to maintain his grip on reality. Where he's still trying to hunt down those damned Eldar who have cheated him out of their souls. He still wants to figure out where the hell Komarog is, and if he can possibly corner a craft world or two, that would be lovely as well. His priorities would be leaning more in that direction, and Nurgle just does Nurgle things. Nurgle is plenty happy in his mansion, wandering around in his gardens, picking up exotic fruits with new and fascinating forms of diarrhea worked into their very DNA, and then feeding these fanciful fruits to unfortunate visitors, which there is apparently a constant stream of humans and Xenos and all manners of things that just kind of plop themselves into his realm on occasion. Somehow I doubt it's entirely by accident, considering how much fun Nurgle has with testing stuff out on them too. As of course nothing makes Nurgle happier than a good plague, which he can then perhaps, expand into the material world once more. And hey, Living Host is a fantastic way of doing just that. But again, the point is, Nurgle doesn't necessarily care that much, except when he really does care. Like when his neighbor brings home a particularly hot date, for example, or when a bunch of creepy-ass pointed-eared fetishists try to break into his house and steal his wife. On these occasions, he cares a great deal, and can apparently be one of the most successful of the gods when it comes to warfare. And there is another interesting question as well, because I'm sure a lot of you have been thinking, but what about Horus's invasion of the realms of chaos? Well, there's perhaps more of a story-centric one, a plot-driven event, shall we say, because Horus invaded Hell alone. And I don't care how much of a badass Horus is, I don't see him pulling that off by his lonesome. So clearly, he must have orchestrated some sort of help. There is mention of demons, of leading armies, of fighting in the legions of Khorne, and so on. Maybe he formed alliances with demon princes, recruited his own armies, waged war, made alliances with the gods, forced some of them to their knees, and stole their power, as he said later on. Now, I firmly do believe that this was all a play, frankly, because again, no matter how powerful a human individual is in the realms of chaos, you are their plaything. You are a fish in an aquarium, and at any point in time, all the water could simply start flowing out and there ain't shit you can do about it. This was a ploy to make Horus feel as if he was in control, because he was always very skeptical of the Chaos powers. He wanted to subdue them, to bring them to their knees, and he was still bound by and large by his own logic and rationale. He viewed the god as as Xenos race more so than anything else. A weird and mystical Xenos race with abilities far beyond the norm, sure, but still something physical, shall we say, something real, something that could be conquered and could be subjugated. At the very least, something that could be negotiated with in, apparently, relative faith. Meanwhile, on the ruinous powers side, they always had their plans for Horus. They needed him, as the God Emperor was one of vanishingly few occasions where the great game was simply put on pause for a while, whilst the God Emperor was dealt with. All four of the powers united to deal with the God Emperor, though even then a bit of fractious issues arose, like the attempt to turn Sanguinius, for example, and make him the favourite of the gods instead of Horus. Nevertheless, the God Emperor epoch was the most peaceful in the warp in its entire damned history, in terms of demon warfare anyways, and Horus's arrival was no doubt a wonderful opportunity for all four of the powers. In fact, I can very much imagine it like this. They knew he'd arrive, and when he did, they took turns with him, basically. Khorne had a couple hundred years of sending challenges his way, watching how he dealt with it, giving him some demonic allies, sending a particularly vicious demon to try and hunt him down, or having him overcome a fortress, or even indeed having him invade the Brass Citadel itself. Until eventually submitting, quote-unquote, lending Horus his powers and sending him over to the next god. Where, say, Tzeentch, for example, could enjoy some good old-fashioned warfare again, and I am sure a Primarch the likes of Horus Lupercal would have provided near endless amusement even for the gods, which is why when he arrived back in real space, to him, absolute eons had passed, when to Abaddon faithfully waiting for him, mere minutes had gone by. And there, of course, is another part of the entire equation as well. Take the rescue attempt of Isha, for example. To the Eldar, things seemed to be proceeding in more or less real time until they were overcome with plagues and their very soul stones rotted away and they died. Meanwhile, to Nurgle, it might have been an eternity of fun and games. It might have been a minute, it might have been 2, might have been 30 seconds. The realms of the Immaterium might have existed for all of eternity, or for the blink of an eye. Hell, both could be true. That's the entire point of the warp. It's kinda fucky. Which is another reason why I presume they enjoyed Horus so much that they kept him there for all of that time. It provided them with a common set of rules to play with. Basically, they were engaged in a few thousand years of high-level 40k. That's one way of looking at it, if nothing else. But theoretically, too, let's assume that Horus could invade Hell, right? And, well, he had a portal, so theoretically, he could have brought more dudes with him. Now, the time constraint is the problem, because by the time the third Chaos Space Marine had entered the portal, number 1 had been in there for 2,000 years already. You know, that's one of those issues with the logistics of this whole thing, but again, theoretically, a large enough host could invade the depths of the Eye of Terror, and maybe even try to enforce some notion of reality on it. In fact, seeing as the realms of chaos is created by human emotion and is a reflection of our universe in its own way, perhaps even a large enough quantity of mortals could transform it somehow, make a part of the realm into something permanent. I mean, hell, the fact that the Eldar psychic powers worked at all deep within the land of Grandfather Nurgle suggests that psychic powers clearly can work within the realms of chaos. Now, once more, we have to return to the question whether or not that was simply just a part of the game, or if they actually did something, if Nurgle could do something to stop them, but it's an interesting thought experiment, if nothing else. Partially disproven, I suppose, by the presence of a certain orc warlord who's spent a few 100,000 years in here now, by chaos warp time probably, and still hasn't conquered a damned sorry thing. They're happy though, so I guess you can't blame them over much. You may also have been noticing I haven't been talking all that much about the logistics or the tactics or the maneuvering or the peculiarities of demonic warfare, because frankly, with the rules being able to be changed by the drop of a hat, there's no playbook here, to put it mildly. Obviously, the various demonic hordes will, well, they'll act more or less in accordance with the nature of their gods. Tzeentch, no doubt, will prefer rapid maneuver-style warfare with traps and feints and fake-outs all over the place. He wouldn't want to face the legions of Khorne on an open field in a fair fight where he's guaranteed to lose. He'd want to face them deep in the shifting lands of his own terrain, where the literal ground will react to benefit him. And mind you, the very ground itself can also be a weapon. You remember that wall of volcanoes that Khorne's got? Well, it's also inhabited by enormous molten lava golems, which are apparently demons of Khorne too, so yeah, there's that to take into consideration as well. And well, many of the usual rules of warfare simply don't apply to demon warfare. What do you do if 10,000 juggernauts come storming out of Khorne's lands, for example? Well, you get the hell out of the way and you make the ground mushy until they get tired, I guess, or you turn the entire ground right beneath them into ice and then liquid, dumping them into an ocean of nitrogen, for example. If you want to deal with an invading army, it can be done in the easiest possible way. In fact, I imagine a great deal of a successful invasion is probably precise scale. You want to invade your neighbor with a large enough force to do something, but not so big that whoever you're invading panics and simply drops the nuclear chaos bumfuckery button on it immediately, wiping it out in total, just like that. Now, for somebody like Khorne, I doubt he's going to have the patience for any of that bullshit, and he's simply going to tell his generals to go over there and take that objective, and how they do it is up to them. And if they learn their lessons well, maybe they get to keep their jobs. If they don't, well, you know, there are enormous smelteries that always need fresh demon souls to be bound into butt plugs and anal beads. Or swords, alternatively, but if we're talking punishment detail here, I feel the former might be more effective in motivating the generals to do a good job. Slaanesh, on the other hand, might want to simply seduce the enemy's armies. That's actually a part of his law, that nobody's ever been able to invade his inner sanctum because Slaanesh is just that hard. And so when anybody actually arrives, they surrender instantly and get turned into... Let's not think about it. Same with Nurgle. How the hell do you invade Russia? Except if Russia was just one enormous swamp filled with malaria and pestilence-carrying bugs. Yeah, there are many, many problems, and even then, okay, well, one invasion force gets to trudge across the swamp, losing a mere 50-60% to malaria. The next time you bring a larger army, and the swamp just turns into an enormous worm that eats all of them instantly. That's the problem with invading the lands of a little god. Unless you've agreed on some ground rules beforehand... I imagine there is not a whole lot of limit to the gay-ass bullshit that can occur. Basically, imagine playing a real-time strategy game against somebody who's cheating a lot, and who's also very sensitive to losing, but at the same time, you're cheating a lot as well. complications are bound to ensue, and it's not going to lead to overly tactical gameplay at most occasions, unless again you both agree to stop cheating, at least for a small, brief period of time, assuming you don't put either side's base in danger. You know, 5 minutes no rush rules, etc. And I think I'll wrap it up there for Demon Warfare in the Warp. And maybe I'll have to do a proper video on the Realms of Chaos itself at some point, because there is actually a fair bit of ridiculous over-the-top lore about the Realms of Chaos, the aforementioned literal wall of volcanoes being one of those. But until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.